Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of A&I. Today, we're going to do something a little bit different. I don't have a guest with me. You just got me. And I want to go over a topic that I actually was asked quite a bit about during this last archery hunting season. And that's really on, like, why do I ride a dirt bike to access hunting areas? And it's a pretty simple question, but I think there's some nuances to it from somebody like myself who's grown up in motorsports and on the dirt bike side of things, got into hunting later in life. I would say probably the only expertise I have would be to talk on behalf of dirt bikes. And the beauty of this is I want to cover a couple things. A, why would we use a dirt bike for hunting? What's out there? The different types of dirt bikes, why would you buy certain dirt bikes over others, the price points that you could expect to find when buying a used bike or even a new bike, and then what features to look for in those specific bikes. So whether you're going and looking at a used bike, what are some things you can go and actually take to the guy that you're going to go find on Facebook Marketplace, and what can you look at when you get to that deal or to that sale that's going to allow you to make a better purchase in the long run. And then last but not least, I'll kind of go over what my current setup is for dirt bikes. Now, my hunting setup doesn't really differ from like my hard enduro and my setup that I'm using for just casual riding, but it really is, in my opinion, one of the better setups. And then maybe I'll talk about like what my ideal setup would be if money wasn't a factor, and I could just kind of special build one for hunting purposes only. So if we kick it off, we'll get kind of first into why do we use dirt bikes for hunting. So for me, it's all about access. I can get wherever I need to go probably twice, if not 10 times faster than dudes on ATVs, UTVs, trucks. That means I get a couple more, 30 more minutes of sleep or another 45 minutes of sleep, depending on where. I also am not necessarily having to fight these people as far as getting into this spot first. I think if anyone's used to Western big game hunting, or if you've come from the Midwest or the East out here, there's trucks at every single pull-off on these mountain roads. You think you're deep, you are not deep, and there's a Ford F-250 sitting there waiting for you. Now, they oftentimes aren't hunting that deep. So they are probably within 2-ish miles of where that truck is, which leaves a ton of country kind of open and waiting for somebody to hunt it. And the animals know this stuff too. So you'll find kind of there's these bubbles of where these animals like to find themselves during these seasons. It's not right on the roads, but it's not, 20, 30, 40 miles back oftentimes. Now there's going to be a ton of kind of outliers. There's a lot of backcountry hunting, and there's dudes that pull in massive animals in the backcountry or in the wilderness where you can't have any sort of motor use vehicle. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I'm talking about what we can do on, the weekenders or dudes that have, hey, I got 2 days to hunt here or 3 days to hunt here. I want to access as much country as possible. And here's how I think you should do it. Now, if we want to kind of make a quick comparison, so dirt bikes versus ATVs or UTVs or e-bikes. For me, the two wheels side of things really opens up a ton of country. You know that anytime you see a single track trail, so something that is too narrow for an ATV or a UTV to fit on, you really aren't going to have a lot of competition. You're either going to have guys on boots, which really limits how far they can go and how quickly they can do it. I would say maybe the worst thing you would have to run into would be guys on horses or using some kind of like pack animal. And, at that point, they're able to get pretty far back and carry a lot of things. Oftentimes they have some, big tents or outfits. And to do that with horses or those types of pack animals, you're not necessarily doing like a a quick weekend trip or hey, I have tonight to hunt. It's a lot of work with those pack animals. I mean, they're living things as well. So you not only have to keep them secure and transport, but once you get into where you're hunting, you have to make sure that they're set up in an area where they can't wander off, or that they're safe and they have food and they have water. So there's a lot of things that kind of go into that side of it. And there's a time and place, and honestly, in the wilderness areas, that is probably your top dog. But for just general units that it's legal to run, motor use vehicles, to me, the dirt bike is going to win every single time. Now, if you're a guy that's just hunting roads, maybe a UTV might work. But for me, I'm looking for these pockets that I can get, 5 miles-ish back pretty quick. I'm looking for particularly rough trails, that might be hard for the average guy to ride a dirt bike on. And I feel like that is a separator. That's where I'm able to get into some more areas where the average guy can't get into on a dirt bike or on a UTV or ATV. And then oftentimes I'm finding myself in elk a lot more frequently in those types of zones. And the elk are extremely smart. They know where humans can get to most of the time, and they know where humans can't. So with that being said, that's kind of the first comparison. I think the other advantages with the dirt bikes is you can, really just kind of stash them wherever you want. Numerous times I've, in a bush, and you really can't even see it from the road or from the trail of where I parked that bike. And I just have an on-X point of right where that bike is. And I come back sometimes in the dark and I'm having to stumble around here and there just to finally find this bike. The other, I would say that's a pretty good kind of benefit. Oftentimes, the fuel consumption is, I think, negligible across different your ATVs and things like that. You're not doing a whole ton. You can carry a water bottle full of gas, and that usually will get you out of any sort of crappy situations you find yourself in. To me, they're a whole heck of a lot easier to maneuver on tight terrain, and I have a couple buddies that have used four-wheelers with me on the same trails, and I can tell you I can get pretty much everywhere, 10 times over them coming in one time. So that's another, I would say, a big one. The modern day 2-strokes, and honestly, a lot of the 4-strokes are a lot quieter than your average ATV or UTV. Oftentimes, if you've been in a spot where somebody's coming at you, kind of like where the animal would be if you were riding into an area, you almost can't hear these things until they're visible. And then oftentimes on the 2-stroke, that note that comes out of that exhaust is so much tamer than a 4-stroke. So it really does drown out in the woods, and it really is, I think a pretty quiet beast to get on in. And then last but not least, of course, just way easier to transport. If you got a truck bed, you can throw it on the back of a truck. This year I had a setup where I had a canopy on my truck bed that I was sleeping in, and then I had a hitch rack that I actually threw the dirt bike on. So I kind of had one little area that was still really easy to maneuver on forest roads if I was driving into a spot or camping. But I can take the bike on and off quick, and then still keep everything in the truck bed that I would need, that would be covered by that cover. So that was another kind of good spot where you can kind of create this compact setup. And to me, I think that's what wins, is if you can be quick in the mornings or quick in the evenings and get your bike unloaded, get all your gear out, ready to rip, in no time at all, and kind of have a nice system. That is where I've found myself to be, I'm not successful in the sense of putting an animal on the ground with it, but getting into zones when I need to by the right time, where I'm not just sitting there thumb and ass trying to figure out where I'm going, what I'm doing, where this piece is that I need to get. So being prepared, being organized, but that doesn't really have anything to do with dirt bikes. So back to the main topic, what's out there? What are the different types of dirt bikes that exist that you would probably run into seeing, either if you were out hunting or if you were surfing on your Facebook marketplaces. So to start, I would say a trail bike is probably going to be like the best bike to look into. Really good for beginners, moderate riders, folks that aren't necessarily making riding dirt bikes their life, and really more of just like using it as a tool to get into the backcountry. This could be your TTR 125s or your TTR 230s. Those are Yamaha trail designated bikes. You know, the engine's relatively gutless. It gets around. It's geared properly, easy to start. They're almost bulletproof. They are some of the easiest bikes to maintain. You just make sure it has oil and gas in it, and it seems to run forever. The other one would be like a CRF 150. There's two different kind of sides of the CRF, which is the Honda version. There's the CRF like 250Fs, 450s. Those are kind of your bigger, more gruntier, dare I say, like race style or enduro style bikes. The CRF that I'm talking about is very comparable to like an XR, which is like their run-of-the-mill, air-cooled, easiest to maintain bike. Usually they're insanely overbuilt. They last forever. Most XRs that I've found are dinosaurs, and they seem to run great without almost any maintenance done on them, which is always crazy surprising. But those honestly are some of like the best. So on the Yamaha side, you have your TTRs. On the Honda side, you have your CRF or your XRs. Kawasaki makes a couple, like the KLRs. All things you can look into. I'm not going to try to explain every single bike and their kind of nuances between brands. It's almost like cars nowadays, where it's like they all do the same thing. They're just a different color and they have a different name on them. But those would be like great ones to look at first and foremost. Oftentimes you're going to be able to find those bikes between $1,500 to $4,000 on the top end, and that's probably for like a newer version of it. And what I've found is oftentimes those bikes, you know, you'll find them and they're going to be ridden hard. They're not going to look the best. You know, like the plastics might have a little crack in them or some white creases from being folded on rocks when they tipped them over. But oftentimes they just work, and they work well, and they'll work forever. They're kind of the slow bike that's hard to completely beat on because they just don't allow it to be with the power and the weight ratio of those things. That would be a great spot to start, and that will get you dang near everywhere you need to go. It won't get you there fast, but it'll get you there. Where I've seen these bikes have troubles would be more so around packing something out. So if you were to get like an elk down or a big mule deer down, they don't necessarily handle all the additional weight that well. And oftentimes something that people would have to consider is that when you're on a dirt bike, it's really awesome for hunting solo. But if you're packing something out solo, it's every quarter for an elk, for instance, is a trip on the bike. So if you ride 5 miles into this spot, you hike a mile, you end up getting something down. That's a mile hike back to the bike with weight. That's a 5 mile ride back to the truck with the meat. And then that's another ride back in and another hike back in to where that animal was down. So it's definitely a process, but what I've found is it's definitely something that's worth the extra hassle that comes with it, because it really is kind of opens up where you can and can't hunt, which is awesome. The next kind of style of bike that I would encourage folks to look into is going to be, I would label it as like an enduro bike. So this is getting into where I mentioned there's kind of a weird difference between like a CRF 250 and then the XR 250 from Honda. Those are kind of, they sound the same, but they are very different in the sense of they start to get to a more performance based machine when you start getting into those 250s or 450s. So on those, kind of on the budget end, I would look at something called a WR250F from Yamaha, or you could look at the CRF 250X. I would probably still stay away from the 450Xs, which is a bigger engine. And the reason why is more power is not always better in this capacity. Usable power is what you want, and power that allows you to feel comfortable on the bike, get you where you need to go, but not necessarily scare you. That would be a pretty big. So those two are almost like your best options. You can find WR250Fs for as cheap as $1,700. I've had a buddy that I did some hunting with this year. He has like a CRF 250X, or had a 250X, which is a 4-stroke 250. It's a more geared towards trail riding than like track riding. Its brother would be a CRF 250R, which is like a race version, like a motocross race version. So there's no headlight. The gearbox is a different ratio, so it handles better on kind of tighter, quicker turns, things like that. But the 250X is the trail version, or the enduro version. And that bike is also, I mean, it's super bulletproof, and he got it for $1,700. He was having a couple issues with it there at the end, but for what he had into it and how much riding he got out of it, I would say it was a great deal on his end. And there's so many of those bikes out there. If you do a quick search on Facebook Marketplace, you're going to find probably 20 to 30 of these, all in that sub, $4,000 price range. Now, on the enduro side, you can get into some more expensive bikes here. This is also where I would say the bike I own falls into. So I own a Husqvarna TE300. So it's a 2-stroke versus the 4-strokes that I've been talking about. The perks of a bike like the one I own is it's a newer 2-stroke. So I own a 2023, has electric start. The engines are relatively bulletproof. Really don't take a lot of, not necessarily maintenance, but it doesn't take, like, you're not having to change a bunch of parts on those bikes unless you are physically breaking something on it, which is a little bit different. But the suspension's great on these newer bikes. The e-start is, again, something that most say they don't need until they're messed off on a steep trail and they just are able to zap the bike on versus having to figure out a way to get around the bike and then kick it over again. It really has become a necessity for me. Having a hydraulic clutch is also something that it's not a necessity, but it definitely makes for long days of pulling that clutch in continuously, just a smoother action. Feels a lot better. It doesn't wear the clutch out nearly as much as a cable actuated clutch. And then the other, I would say, on those bikes that make them so powerful is their motors, their bottom end capability, where we call it lugging the bike. But really it's just running a bike at a really low RPM, where it just tractors along. It's moving the rear wheel. It's not spinning the rear wheel. And you can get over so much rough, steep, dare I say, shitty terrain, smoothly, effectively, easily. And then the other thing you have to think of is like why that's important. It's not a big deal when you're out and you're with buddies and you're just trying to rip a hill and everyone's riding. You have no other objectives other than riding. But when I'm using a dirt bike for hunting, it really becomes just a tool. It's how can I get into this spot as quietly, as quickly, and as effectively and safely as I can. So having a bike that I can ride at those really controlled low speeds, but still being able to get over obstacles and things that are going to separate me from other people trying to get into those zones. That's kind of the beauty of the type of bike that I own. Now, I would say, like, you can spend a lot of money when you start getting into those ranges. I think right now, like a 2023 Husqvarna TE 300 is probably going to go around $7,500, $7,500 to $8,000, depending on condition and all of that. And then on the new side, I mean, the new bikes are from the dealership around 13 to 14 grand, which is absurd, but that is the going rate. You can find some of the older bikes. So like a 2018 or 2019 KTM, Husqvarna, Gas, Beta. There's so many different brands, but they all kind of do that same thing. If you're getting a enduro model, one with a headlight, and they have electric start, they were semi-reliable. I would not say necessarily as reliable as they are today or ride as good as they do today, but they will still get you into everything you need to get into without issues. And you can get into one of those, at 45 to $6,000. So you can definitely find a bike that's going to fit your budget as well as your needs. Now, an area that I would want to crack down on is, I've had buddies and I've had people reach out to me this year asking, hey, I've been looking at this, KX 450. So a Kawasaki Race 450, which is like the biggest engine they make, on those dirt bikes or those, race motocross bikes. And I can't stress enough that if you're using it for trail riding, or especially in this kind of special use case, hunting or fish, whatever, do not get a 450 race bike. Don't even get a 250F race bike. And when I say race bike, I'm talking like a motocross version. So one without a headlight, without a kickstand, specially made to ride a closed course track. Please stay away from those bikes. And the reason why I say that is because they are some of the hardest damn things to ride on tight mountain trails. So the buddy that I'm thinking of specifically, and I'm not going to out him by saying his name, but he ended up getting a 450. And on that first ride, I saw him tip that thing over so many times. I saw him kill it so many times. And we were trying to get into a spot to go bear hunting. And I think we missed our window by a good hour and 30 minutes because the bike that he was on was simply really dang hard to ride on the tight mountainous single track that we have here in North Idaho. Now, if he was riding just forest roads, that could have been a different story. I think he probably easily could have been fine on it. But the other is those bikes are so dang loud. They almost sound like rolling thunder. And you can hear those four strokes from much further away than you can a trail version of a four stroke, which has quite a bit more of like a muffler on it. So you really can't get those same decibels. And then the two strokes that really are much quieter than both of those. So again, stay away from the race bikes or the race motocross bikes. They're also just not built for the kind of riding that you would want to do. The gas tanks are typically smaller. The gearing itself is going to lend to more top end speed than necessarily like a low end kind of usable power, especially when you're in like rocky or tough terrain. So these are all things to consider when you're making a purchase around like what bike to start on for it. And honestly, if most people are new to riding bikes, I almost need or try to steer them towards something with a lot less power than they think they need, because you can always go up and get more. But when you start with way too much, you can end up scaring yourself to the point where, you really don't want to be out there. And it's something that everyone should it should put a massive smile on your face. It shouldn't be like making you pissed off, throwing your helmet, or in this case of my buddy who, ended up falling down the hill and like landing on his rifle that was on or strapped to his back. Things that are just like, that shouldn't happen. And it's not fun. So if anything, I want somebody to take away from this is like, you're not a pussy buying a WR 250 to go hunting or to go trail riding and to learn it. If anything, a lot of people that are in the space or that are like competent riders would look at you if you pulled up with like a 450 motocross race bike, that you have no idea what you're doing. And honestly, like most just like sit back and kind of like let the shit show ensue, because that's exactly what's going to happen. Me as even a proficient rider can't ride those things very well in tight single track, without stalling it or probably swearing. So just little things to consider when looking at kind of those different bikes on there. Even though the race bikes could be cheaper, please stay away. So the next segment is, if you were going to look at a bike to buy, what are some things you would want to inspect or take a look at to kind of ensure that maybe this bike is not beat on, or you're going to get some life out of it. I always kind of do just like a quick once over on a lot of the welds on the frame, especially on like those TTR 125s, kind of the smaller trail bikes. And the only reason I say that is because if they're used for the purpose that they're built for, you probably won't have any issues at all. But oftentimes those types of bikes get used for like pit bikes, we call them, or like just bikes that you would ride as like a grown dude, just around a small track, or kind of make some little jumps and little doubles to hit. But when you have a 220-pound dude on a small bike, you're not necessarily going to have the best time ever if you end up casing something or hitting something that you shouldn't have been hitting. It's always just a good kind of once over. Oftentimes you won't find ever a crack on those types of things, but it's good to look, especially on the aluminum ones or aluminum frames. But again, good to look. You probably won't find anything, but just something to see. The next would be, I would usually inspect around what we call the fork stanchions. So if you look at kind of the telescopic suspension fork on the front of the bike, you will see where the outer tube kind of goes into another shinier tube on the bottom. Those stanchions are something I would look at or inspect. You want to see if there's any dents in those, or if there's scratches or scarring. That can generally kind of tells me that the fork hasn't been serviced. Usually fork would need new oils, new seals, new internals. Like we do them on our bikes that we ride, every 50 to 60 hours, depending on how much, and that's engine hours. But with that being said, on some of these trail bikes, like it's likely that they've probably never been touched their entire lives. And honestly, if you're not going to use this thing as like a performance bike, if you're buying one of those kind of lower end or cheaper trail bikes, it's probably not going to be a big deal for you. Just make sure it's not leaking around any of those seals, because there is oil in those, or there should be oil. And if you're getting like any dripping or anything like that, or kind of like a spot that looks really wet with oil around that on the suspension, so there's a rear shock in that front fork, I would personally, like, that might be a good reason to either steer away, because to rebuild them, you're probably going to be looking at around $500 to $600. And if you're spending $1,700 on a bike, that might not be something you want to then fork over that much money for. The next is I would move down to what we call the chain and sprockets. So that's the drive chain, your rear sprocket, which is on the rear wheel, and then your counter shaft sprocket, which is sitting on the engine, or not in the engine, but it's sitting on a shaft that's coming out of your engine. Usually it has like a little protector, like a plastic chain case protector on it. I would inspect those to see. So I would look both at the sprockets that are there. What tells me if they're really worn out is if they start to kind of look like a shark fin, where the tooth on them starts to curl over or have like a really sharp point. That would tell me that they're more or less on their last leg. And that could be a good negotiation tactic for you to kind of, hey, chain and sprockets, that's $120 for just the sprockets, maybe $220 for chain and sprockets. That could be a good negotiating tactic if you are seeing that that's worn out. And then, of course, looking at the condition of the chain, are you getting a lot of side-to-side play on it? Is there rust on it? That's generally like the quick little things. If that's perfect, then cool. But oftentimes on an older bike, you're going to have some of that wear. And again, it's a good spot to check. Or you can also see that, hey, they might have changed it. So something to look at there. The next would be if you can, you can buy it from Harbor Freight or go on Amazon, but get a compression tester. So with these dirt bikes, they all have only one cylinder. So they're super easy to compression check. You literally bring a wrench that you can take your spark plug off with. You screw in your compression tester, look up the specs before you go. And that's usually like you could use ChatGPT. It'll tell you exactly what the compression should be for that bike or for that engine. Screw that compression tester on. If it's an e-start, it'll have you kind of cycle it over a couple times. Or if it's a kick start, you're going to kick it, 5 to 6 times or until the gauge stops moving. And then that will tell you, hey, is this engine in spec? What it means to be in spec for a compression test is, hey, is this engine healthy? Yes, it has the compression it's supposed to have. That's usually a good indicator that the engine is doing okay and it's not going to need anything anytime soon. If it's low compression, then generally that's where you have some issues. Dirt or sand got into the cylinder and started scratching the cylinder, so you're having blow by on the piston rings. That could be one of many different things that could cause low compression, but generally all that means is your engine health is not good. An engine to do, it's going to totally depend on what kind of bike or engine. So 2-stroke versus 4-stroke. 2 strokes, you're generally going to see a much cheaper bill. I would say like to rebuild, say like my bike, for top end wise, you're probably going to look at $300. For a top end for a 4-stroke, you might be looking at, $600 to $800. Really going to depend on the bike. But if you can take one thing from that is if you're buying a used bike, you're not going to want to have to throw a new engine in it. So it's an easy check. The compression testers are, $25 on Amazon. They're worth having because you can also use it on dang near anything with a spark plug. So something to consider, especially if you're going to kind of start to delve into the power sports world. Not the last, but definitely one pretty critical one would be checking the electrical system on it. If it has a headlight, is the headlight coming on when I hit the switch? That's not necessarily the end of the world, but if that's having an issue, who's not to say there's something else having issues on there. If you buy a bike like the one I have, it has a radiator fan. Sometimes it is worth letting that bike idle and kind of riding it around at really low RPMs and speeds to let it build up heat enough to see if that fan turns on or not. Radiator fan's $220. So that's an easy thing to check when you're there. And if the guy is not wanting you to do that, that would also be a red flag to me because that's something that, hey, it's a perk that's on this bike. And I want to show you that it works. The next I would say would be read the guy's body language. Like really don't, I hate to say it because I don't want to make it sound like I don't have faith in people, but in a way, it's like, don't trust the guy completely. Like really look at everything like skeptically. And honestly, like I would be a little bit overboard on some of it because, hey, you're there to make a deal. You don't have to be crazy to the guy and try to like lowball the crap out of him. But at the same token, like be critical. It's a bike that you're going to then be taken on. And when you take it on, every issue it has becomes your burden. So that's where if there's any little thing that you're like, hey, I don't love that this, is cracked, or I don't love that this plastic piece is broken off, hey, that's going to cost me $50. Tell them that. Tell him, hey, let's take $25 off the price. That'll kind of split the middle, done and done. One of the other massive things to check on a used bike is going to be the air filter. And that's honestly maybe the most important outside of a compression test is the air filter clean? Did the guy give a shit enough to clean the air filter before selling this thing? Depending on the bike you're looking at, it might be yes, it might be no. But what I do personally is I take that filter off, and you take your finger, you run it down that air box into the air boot, which would go into, depending on what bike you're looking at, either the throttle body or the carburetor, and then feel around in there. Is there any grits of sand? Is there anything back there that you don't want behind an air filter that's supposed to stop all of that stuff? And that's honestly probably the biggest red flag that I can find, is if somebody doesn't clean their air filters on a bike, the likelihood of that engine being healthy is slim to none. And then on top of that, if there is dirt that's getting past that air filter, I personally can't expect that guy to have also changed the oil or to do any of the other required maintenance on a bike that you are buying used. So that would be, just another main one. And then some other simple ones would be just making sure that, hey, is this bike cold? Tell them not to warm it up before you get there. You want to kind of see what that whole thing looks like. Some bikes have a really hard time starting when they're cold. Some bikes have an even harder time starting when they're hot. So being able to see it starting from both sides of it is definitely critical. And then being able to kind of do your run through on the bike. Is it shifting through all the gears? Are the brakes working? Speaking of brakes, that would be another great spot to look. Is there a massive kind of worn ridge around the brake rotors on each wheel that could indicate like a ton of hours on the bike? Or are the brake pads worn all the way down to the metal? Brake pads aren't necessarily expensive, but it could, give you, hey, could you take $20 off? I'm going to have to buy new pads. I think brake pads, depending on which ones you buy, are anywhere from like $17 to $30 a pair, for a pair for the rear, a pair for the front. That's something to kind of look at or look into. And then also, if oftentimes these bikes will have engine hours on them. So like a tachometer that'll have like an engine hour readout on it. And usually what I would say is like for a trail 450 a trail 250, like the CRF or the WRs that I was mentioning earlier, anywhere from 80 to 100 hours on a bike like that from 2007, like you're going to expect some higher hours, some higher mileage. That's kind of why you do the other compression testing and things like that. On a newer bike, so like a, 2020, 2022, 23, as you kind of climb into the current model years. I personally, according to the book, I think you have to, or you don't have to, but changing like a piston on like a KTM or a Husqvarna 300 two-stroke, I think it's around like 80 to 100 hours. I think maybe at the top end be like 120 hours. And it's like most of the time on these bikes, like it's not even critical to change that by that time. Like the cylinder and the piston are probably perfectly fine. But when you're buying a new bike and you're kind of on that end of not knowing completely how the guy rode it, did he buy a trail bike and then go ride a bunch of track with it? And that greatly differs like the intervals on how often you're doing maintenance to a bike. I would just say to be wary of higher hours or higher mileage newer bikes. Oftentimes, again, if it's a bike that's been around for not that long, but it has 200 hours on it, like the guy rode the piss out of it. If it's a bike that's from 2007 and it has 200 hours on it, like it really wasn't ridden that much every year. So little things to kind of think about or consider when going to take a look at a bike. And honestly too, I mean, if you follow me on Instagram, and you are going to check out a bike and you want to send it my way just to get kind of a gut check, by all means do it. Because that's the kind of stuff that I wish I had the ability to kind of like interfere with even a couple buddies' purchases. before they purchased them. And then I kind of had to go through the heartbreak of them realizing they bought the wrong bike and then having to sell it and then finally getting into a bike that was better for them. So if we can expedite that process and just get somebody on the right bike right away, that's amazing. And then, at the same token, I'm able to spread my love of dirt bikes for that. So in the next kind of component, I wanted to go over a couple key features for hunting specifically that I think are pretty, not necessarily must-haves, but I do think that they are they make a big enough difference that it's nice. One being a quiet freaking exhaust. I've seen so many dudes on bikes with like aftermarket exhausts, and I'm like, throw the stock one back on. Like, you want it to be quiet for hunting. You're not looking for like the most performance and all of this stuff. I love a loud bike too when I'm not hunting, but for hunting, quiet exhausts. The next would be, and I do find a lot of value in having like a skid plate or handguards on your bike. So oftentimes when I'm hunting, you're riding single track, you're riding in the dark, you're riding out in the dark. You're not always able to see every tree you're riding by and that kind of thing. So it just adds a little bit of protection for the hands. And then again, when I'm riding for hunting, like I am the most cautious version of myself because again, my goal with the dirt bike during hunting season is it gets me to where I can hunt and it gets me back to the truck from where I was hunting. No other reason, rhyme about it. I'm not out there to enjoy the trail. I'm not going on a midday, moto ride. It's used as just a mechanism for traveling. So keep that in mind. The next is, depending on the type of bike, I've seen some pretty awesome like cargo racks on it, or like a base plate that goes over your rear fender. Pretty awesome for hauling meat, where you can kind of just rest that your backpack on that cargo rack. Again, that's not something that I think is necessary, but it is nice to have. Fuel tank size. So they make some aftermarket ones, like a 3.5 gallon, 4 gallon one. I don't think you have to go crazy overkill, but if you're planning on doing a couple nights, out of your backpack and camping back there, having more fuel than not is always a good thing. So that is something that I do think is worth taking a look at. One that I think most people don't or think should come on every bike, but it doesn't, is a kickstand. And having a good one that allows you to just throw that thing down and go, especially if you're on like uneven terrain, because oftentimes you're never just on like a perfectly flat piece of land, especially if you're up in the mountains. But that's a key one. So you're not always having to find a tree to lean it on or anything like that. You can find a bush to kind of stash it behind and call it good. And then I've seen some really good ones like GPS mounts, or like phone holders on the handlebars. I personally don't have one of those, but it is so nice from having to go to your pocket to grab your phone to look at Onyx to see where the trail turnoff is. Did I pass it? Am I right there? I've seen some pretty good things with that, but that's just kind of one thing to talk about. And then the other would be, and this is not the most important, but up there in importance, because people don't think about it, is these bikes, as nice as they are to get you as far away from people and things as they can also strand you back there. So making sure you have like a pretty good kit that you can fix most things on the bike. KTM makes an awesome one that comes with the bike when you buy it new. And it's something that I think personally is like, it can almost tighten or loosen every bolt on the bike. You can do most general maintenance with it. I think if you do a once over on the bike and you're really like, you've been out and you've put some miles on the thing and you're confident in your machine, you probably won't run into any issues. But like, you want to pack levers. You want to pack an extra shift lever, for the foot. You want to maybe pack like an extra brake pedal for the rear. Those are things that like get overlooked, but as soon as you tip over and the rock hits that thing perfectly, and now all of a sudden you don't have a clutch, like that makes riding in the mountains pretty tough. So something to consider is just having kind of a bulletproof kit that's light that you can just keep in your pack. Or again, find some spots on the bike to be able to stash it, like a handlebar bag where it lives on the actual bars of the bike is a great spot to have that type of tool and things like that. The next would be your tire setup. So I've seen it a couple times where guys just have like your stock, your tube, your rubber inner tube filled with air, and we're 10 miles back on a ride, and then all of a sudden that tire went flat from some rock that it hit, and there's no spares, and now we're resorted to limping the bike out, as slow as it can go, hoping that it doesn't come off the rim. I personally think if you have the money to do it, looking into a tubeless or some kind of system for your tire that does not involve air. So what I personally use is called a moose bib. Think of like a big closed cell foam donut that fills your tire, the inner space of your tire, without needing any air. So it can take punctures all day long, and I'm never going to lose the hold of my tire. And that's a pretty important one, I think, to consider for most people, is like, that's a bulletproof setup. When you're out there and you have a moose bib in your front and rear tire, and you know that no matter what, you're not going to get a flat tire, like, it's a pretty liberating feeling, that knowing, hey, I can go kind of wherever I want. The next would be looking at like the compound of your tire. If you're running out there and you have like a really hard compound, so meaning like a hard rubber, they make what they call gummy tires, which is a much softer compound. You can almost like twist the knobs in your fingers. And I think finding something maybe right in the middle of those two, like on my hard enduro setups, so like for riding like really, really nasty stuff, I would run like a gummy tire. For guys that are just using a bike to go ride around and they almost don't want to have to do, buy anything for it yearly, it's like a set it and forget it. My personal go-to would be like, it's IRC is the company that makes it, but the VE33 Gakota. So it's like GEKOTA or something like that. It's a semi-gummy tire with big knobs. And I think that tire is probably one of the better all-around tires. You'll get a lot of life out of it, but then it's also lends for a much better sense of traction in a lot of those things. And when I say like, hey, I want to ride this bike in and out and I don't want to worry about anything else, that also means I want to ride it in safely and ride it out safely. And if I'm spinning my rear tire going up a hill or over, some difficult obstacle, that's not lending to me being safe on it. And quite frankly too, I mean, when all of a sudden you're spitting rocks, down a scree field or something like that, like if anything's around, it knows something's weird, something's up. So I try not to do that. I think that tire setup is pretty important and pretty key. And I've seen a lot of guys go from shitty riders to pretty average once we've dialed in their tire setup to lend to better traction in the mountains. Last but not least, I wanted to quickly cover kind of what my current setup is on the bike. I kind of told you what make and model, but so I'm riding a 2023 Husqvarna TE300. So it's a 2-stroke enduro model from them. It is sprung, so suspension-wise, you can spring things to your weight, or valve them, we call it, to your weight. I have all the suspension done to my specs. With it being kind of built to be more of the hard enduro bike, it's going to have a much softer setup with more rebound, so it springs back quite a bit quicker. And then for hunting, I think it still works really good. And then if I get an animal down and I'm using it to shuttle things out, I have turned what we call the compression up. So that is the resistance of the shock compressing or the fork compressing together. And if you dial that, it will support you quite a bit more when you have 80, 90 pounds of meat on your back. I have it geared down, so I run a 12-tooth front sprocket with a 50 rear. And I find that it gives me like my second gear to be a lot more rideable. in just everything, where I don't feel like I'm hitting that like top range of my power. And then first gear becomes what I call like a bailout gear. And a bailout gear is really nice because if you get stuck on a hill that's steep, the bailout gear is going to be a much easier gear to start from when you're at a dead stop, especially when you don't want to like clutch pop it and let every animal know that you're stuck on the side of the hill. I run a moose system in my tires, so that airless system. And then I'm running a gummy tire in the rear, and then just your standard tire up front. And I feel like that does a really good job of giving me enough traction in the mountains, especially like if you encounter it in the rain or, later in the season, like, end of September or beginning of October, where we're getting a lot more rain and it's holding moisture because of the weather itself. That's when rocks and other things or roots get really slick. So having the extra traction, I don't think anyone's ever complained about having too much traction. The next kind of piece is that I do have a headlight on it. And then I also carry a 1500 lumen light that actually attaches to the top of my helmet. And those two in combination do a tremendous job. The light on my helmet is following where my eyes are looking, and the light on the front of the bike is kind of the beacon that doesn't change. It's just illuminating the trail right in front of you. And I've done night rides with that setup, and it does a great job. But again, great for getting in and out while you're on the bike in the dark, because most of the time you're riding in the dark and you're riding out in the dark. And I think it does. It's a really good setup, and it's light, and that light can just stay on your helmet. And then again, the light just stays on your bike. So it's not more weight that you have to lug around in the woods after you're hunting off the bike. And that's really it outside of some protection parts like my skid plate, my hand guards, linkage protectors. I mean, because of the style of riding I do with more of that hard enduro focus, I have to have a lot of protection on the bike just for the way we ride. Not necessarily necessary if you're using the bike just for hunting, but if you're using it for kind of recreation and hunting, more protection is never going to hurt you. And I think, having a lot of the good stuff, like I personally love the brand SXS. So they call them slide plates, but they're essentially like a plastic poly plate that goes under your engine on the frame, and it makes for sliding over logs and rocks and things like that really, really easy. You don't hang up on any of that stuff. And then it's kind of a flat surface that allows for that to really just glide over. And they make some really good like shark fins for your rear brake rotor, so you don't worry about bending anything if it hits a rock, or a front rotor guard. They do absolutely critical protection that I find really valuable. And then last but not least, and I'm going to add this to the feature that we just did right before this, explaining my setup, but I think it is critical to have radiator guards or braces on your bike. So I use the Bulletproof Design ones. I think Enduro Engineering makes some really good ones also. But on the newer KTMs, that's been like their Achilles heel, is if you dump them over and it hits the radiator just perfectly, it'll actually poke a hole in the radiator hose and just leak out all your coolant. And then the radiator is good as smashed at that point. The other is like I've seen guys like tip over and they'll mangle their radiators and it'll start leaking out of one of the welds. The radiator braces or guards allow you to completely like not have to worry about it. Like you can tip your bike over, you can, spill it, you can lean it up against trees, and nothing's going to happen to the radiator, which is the kind of the lifeblood of your engine, as far as keeping it cool and running well. So something to consider is like to me, that's like one of probably the most necessary first purchases as far as like a protection piece for your bike. But I'm not riding a bike nowadays without one. A radiator itself, I think, is like $270, and you got two of them. And then the radiator guards are like $160 $130 or $150. So to me, it's more than worth the extra expenditure to protect those radiators. Anything else? I think my bike's mostly stock. I haven't really done much to engine wise, or nothing really internal. A lot of mine's just like gearing, suspension setup, that kind of stuff. And then, again, just making sure you get out and you are comfortable on these dang things. I've seen it time and time again. Guys don't touch their bikes until hunting season. And then now all of a sudden they're poor riders, and you're throwing a 30 to 40 pound pack on their backs, having to ride these trails they're not confident riding without them. So I personally think like it is very important to get out, do some drills, set aside time to be proficient on a bike if you're going to use it for hunting. And the main reason I say that is because just as you would with archery, at least I sure hope you're doing it with archery, is you're practicing all summer long. Because in the moment you want to make that shot and you want to be an ethical hunter. And I think in that moment for dirt bikers, like when you're riding in, I think the last thing you should be worried about is your ability level of getting through a trail. I think it should be just something that you can do and never have to think twice about it. I think I probably talked long enough about dirt bikes and what I think would make for a great setup for the hunting, but I'm super curious to kind of hear your thoughts. So hit me up on Instagram at Adrenaline and Instinct. I want to hear what you ride, what you use to get back. And I know I'm going to get some messages about, I use my F250 and it's fine. And I'm sure it is. But if you're looking for something better and you don't want to be a bitch, then start looking at some two-wheel machines. Other than that, guys, I appreciate you listening to me ramble on about why I think dirt bikes are the sickest things in the freaking world. And with that being said, we're kind of going to be changing the tides from more of the hunting topics to more of the snow sports and getting back on kind of the normal schedule of what's in season. But with that being said, I will give you kind of my last or my update on how the hunting season went, because I kind of went MIA there for the month of September, which I typically do every year. But it started off great. I was into elk most days. I think there was only a few that I weren't. But man, I was struggling so much with getting them in closer than 40 yards. And for any of you that have hunted North Idaho, you know that 40 yards is by no means a slam dunk. You know, oftentimes you don't even see the bull or the animal. You just hear it and, you know, can see stuff moving, but you can never actually get the actual image of the elk. It's super frustrating. And I was having that daily, I felt like a good opportunity in the morning where that would happen, and then a good opportunity in the evening where that would happen. A couple times I thought it was really going to work, and it ended up not. And then earlier in the season, it's actually the same guy that I was talking about that purchased the wrong bike. But we rode into one of my good feel good spots, and we happened to ride like right into the middle of the herd. And like we parked the bikes, we were probably 30 minutes before like any sort of like visible light, like even gray light. I usually try to do that and kind of allow for like 30 minutes of just like nature to settle before I start moving. But I get in and like we park the bikes, and then all of a sudden there's a bugle 50 yards to the left of us, 50 yards to, north of us, and then to the right of us. And it was like we were surrounded by bulls, and we like are sitting there waiting. They're getting closer because they're just kind of going back and forth to each other. We haven't even made a sound yet. And we're going, the wind's pouring right into our faces. It's perfect. And we wait. We finally have some light. Like I couldn't even see my pins yet on my bow, which is on the sight housing. Like it's what you use to make a shot. And I started walking up the trail that was kind of closest to where they were at. And I'm going. And then I get to this little clear cut, and there's a bull moose, which I have no tag for. I can't shoot. And I'm just like, what is going on? And I kind of move past that, because the bull moose isn't going to spook out of there like a buck or even like a bull elk. Like most of the time they just kind of see you and they really don't care. So I push past him. I keep working up, and I'm in a call-in match with the big bull. He's getting a little closer. He's kind of doing what they do, where they're just running all over the place. He's close to me, and then all of a sudden he's 100 yards away from me, but then he's back close again. And through all of this kind of back and forth, I don't know if the wind had just switched a little bit or something, but all of a sudden to my right, kind of where that bull moose was, you just hear this bark, which is like the last thing you ever want to hear. For those of you that hunt, but for those of you that don't, it's like basically like they call it like an alarm bark. So it's notifying the herd like, hey, something's up. And a tactic that you can do that I've heard, again, I'm not the elk expert by any means, but the tactic is like you bark back at them, which kind of shows like, hey, I don't know what you're talking about, but you're scaring me as much as, I'm scaring you. And it confuses them, nothing bolted out of there. But shortly after I had a little bit more of a call-in match, and then that herd just kind of worked hard over the hill and spilled into the next drainage. And we like scrambled up to the top, got our binoculars out to kind of see if we could recover or spot any of these others. And going up the other side of the drainage, you ended up seeing like 3 or 4 6 points, a 5 point, really freaking awesome bulls running through, and great to see. It's always good to see a bull, but to see them, to know you were 30 to 40 yards from them, just 10 minutes before that, it's always like a gutting feeling. Before that really awesome day, I did pass up a spike bull. I think like second or third day of the season. It was like a 65-yard shot or 70-yard shot. Didn't feel confident doing that. I mean, that's like I can hit it at that, but just the situation didn't lend to it. It was like a straight downhill shot, and he wasn't moving quick, but he wasn't staying still either. So that I thought it wasn't the best to do. Had him, and then the next day I had another spike in. He was like about 40 yards, and I just kind of actively like let him pass. I was on to some other big boys and wanted to make that happen. But kind of as it goes with elk hunting, I got into like day 19, and when you still don't have an arrow released yet, and you're starting to kind of like, hey, I got to go back to work in like 3 or 4 days. If I don't get something down, then like there it goes. And I was kicking myself about all of the spikes that I passed up, and was just like, man, I would totally go for one of those right now, and was just having all of the doubts in the world. Because when it really comes down to it, like I'm a guy that puts meat in the freezer. I would love to have, antlers on the wall, but that is not the first priority when it comes to it. Is like, I want good, healthy meat to eat all year. And with that being said, I got into a zone that was actually a lot closer to the house than most. Where I live, there's a lot of public land around me, and I can get out and hunt, but was doing a little bit of calling back and forth, and this spike ends up coming out, just kind of responding to the other communication with the bulls, and right at 38 yards. And I think it was like, I was like mulling over if I should take the shot or not. And I think as I was like, yeah, you should do it, I was watching an arrow pass through it. And needless to say, that was the bull I ended up with. Part of me is like, man, it's a spike, and I should have let him grow bigger the next year. But I didn't want to go 2 seasons without getting one done. And I also, quite frankly, like elk meat's one of my favorite meats to eat So it being in the freezer for me and my wife is like one of, it's a very important thing for us to have in there. And luckily the bull that I got 2 years ago was big enough that it kind of lasted, a year and some change for the two of us with the extra deer that we had. So that was the bull that I ended up landing on. And my punishment for myself was I had to do all the butchering and packing and all of that stuff by myself because I decided to take the spike. But that was the outcome for elk season. So we were successful. It wasn't exactly the bull I wanted to shoot, but more than happy being successful, knowing that the odds are not in our favor. I also, during that, was able to get on a pretty nice, like a 5x4. In the West, we don't say like a 9-point like we do in the Midwest. I don't know why they do it that way, but for you Midwest listeners, a nice 9-point deer. For you folks in the West, a nice 5x4 whitetail that I was able to arrow. And that was another one that like just kind of quickly happened and was awesome, but it was also probably one of like the most, not nerve-wracking situations, but like gutting situations. So this deer, when I shot it, he kind of jumped the trigger just a little bit. So when I say jump the trigger, I mean like they almost anticipate something's happening and they either will drop lower, and sometimes they kind of like brace. So they'll kind of like turn and drop. And I accounted for the drop because most whitetail deer do this, but what I didn't account for was the little turn he did. And I ended up putting it, instead of like, it's still breadbasket, I would say, but putting it through his shoulder versus like just his vitals. And luckily I was shooting a fixed blade, so it punched right through the shoulder. That was no problem. And it wedged to the other shoulder. And the only issue with that type of shot is that oftentimes if you punch through the shoulder or through the scapula, you don't get any blood that comes out of it. So it makes tracking that animal really, really difficult. And this deer decided to go, probably 600 to 700 yards. Luckily, there was a trail that he ran to and then on. And I just kept following that trail. I kind of could see his tracks. I knew it was at least deer tracks. There was a buck track. And was following that along and just kind of using my binoculars every, 10 to 15 feet, glassing around, just trying to see if I can find anything, moving, glassing around, seeing if I can find anything. And then eventually, I just by a stroke of luck, honestly, I looked up the hill and I just see a brown and white patch. So it was his hind end that I could see and kind of track. And in all honesty, it was one of those where like, how he got back up there, I don't know like what he did, or as soon as he ran uphill, he lost, kind of everything and must have just tipped right over. But that was when there was no blood. We were just following tracks. I was super happy to find him, in all honesty. But that was my 2025 archery season recap, quick and dirty. I'll probably have one of the guys I hunted a lot with this year on, and we can kind of chop it up over some of the funny stories and misses and things like that. But the other is I do have one more tag that I can use either for another whitetail or mule deer, which starts next month. And then my wife has a whitetail tag that she's been really kind of having her eye on, a couple big boys that she's wanting to get down. So we still have some hunting to do yet, and I'm sure that's not the last time you'll hear about it. But in the meantime, be looking forward. We'll be switching gears more to the motorsports side of it, whether it's dirt bikes or sleds or the non-motorsports stuff with skiing or snowboarding. We got some cool stuff in the works here. And also let me know, did you like just kind of hearing my rundown on a certain topic that I've been getting a lot of questions on? I'd love to hear the feedback. So with that, cheers.